The Texas hill country stretches out beneath a February sky, brown and gold and endless. Somewhere in that vastness, a gravel road climbs into the hills, past fallen fences and forgotten pastures. At the end of it stands a house, sagging porch, rotted boards, windows dark as closed eyes, 20 years abandoned. Inside a lawyer's office in town, a young woman in a black dress sits between her brother and sister. Her hands are folded tight in her lap. The attorney reads 3 names, 3 properties, and when her name is called last, her brother laughs out loud. Then an old man crosses the room. He leans close. His voice is barely a whisper. Your father knew exactly what he was doing. Somewhere behind that ruined house, hidden beneath 40 years of silence, water waits under the ground. Someone has already offered $3 million for it, and someone else is watching from a black truck on the ridge. The lawyer's office smelled of old leather and older secrets. Delaney Ashford sat in the middle chair, her hands folded in her lap, her black dress feeling 2 sizes too small around her chest, where the grief had settled and refused to move. To her left, her older brother Colton leaned back with the casual confidence of a man who already knew the ending of the story. To her right, her sister Meredith kept her eyes fixed on the window, her jaw tight, her fingers wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. Outside, the Texas hill country stretched brown and gold under a February sky. Cedar Falls was a town of 11,000 souls, most of them ranchers, most of them the kind of people who still tipped their hats when a woman walked by. But inside this room, on this morning, 3 grown children waited to hear what their father had decided their lives would become. Hollis Ashford had been buried 9 days ago. The attorney, a heavy-set man named Buchanan with reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, cleared his throat and began to read. Delaney barely heard the opening formalities. Her mind kept drifting back to her father's hospital room, to the way his hand had felt in hers on that last afternoon, papery and warm, and to the way his eyes had held hers for a long moment before he'd whispered something she couldn't quite catch. She'd leaned closer, her ear almost to his lips, but the words had come out as breath, not sound. He'd smiled then, just barely, and that was the last thing he'd ever done. To my son Colton Ashford, Buchanan read, I bequeath the entirety of Blackwood Ranch, comprising 2,000 acres, the main house, all outbuildings, livestock and mineral rights thereto attached. Colton's mouth twitched. He'd been expecting it. Blackwood was the crown jewel of the Ashford holdings, the ranch their grandfather had built with his own hands during the Depression. 400 head of the finest Angus cattle in 3 counties. Delaney watched her brother permit himself a small, controlled nod, the kind of nod that meant everything was going according to plan. To my daughter Meredith Ashford, I bequeath Greenfield Farm in its entirety, comprising 800 acres of cultivated land, the farmhouse, the barns, all equipment, and the water rights associated therewith. Meredith's expression didn't change. She just kept staring at the window. Greenfield was a working farm that turned a steady profit every year, growing sorghum and running a small dairy operation. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid, reliable. The kind of inheritance a practical woman would appreciate. Buchanan paused. He looked at Delaney over the tops of his glasses, and something in his face flickered, something that might have been apology. To my daughter Delaney Ashford, he read, I bequeath the property known as Willow Creek Homestead, comprising 300 acres, together with all structures thereon, all mineral and water rights, and all personal effects contained within the main dwelling. The silence that followed was not silence at all. It was the sound of Colton Ashford, failing to contain a laugh. It came out through his nose, a short, sharp breath, and then he actually said the words out loud, right there in the lawyer's office, with their father not yet cold in the ground. Willow Creek, well, I'll be damned. Delaney felt the heat climb up her neck. Willow Creek, the old place, the forgotten place. 300 acres of nothing, tucked up against the county line, where the roads turned to gravel, and then to dirt, and then to memory. The house up there hadn't been lived in for 20 years. The last time she'd seen it, when she was maybe 16, the roof had been sagging like the back of an old horse. The fences were gone. The fields were choked with cedar and mesquite. It was, without question, the worst piece of property her father had owned. And he had left it to her. Meredith finally turned from the window. She looked at Delaney, and for just an instant there was something in her sister's eyes that Delaney couldn't read. Not pity, not satisfaction, something more complicated. Then it was gone, and Meredith looked back at Buchanan and asked, in her flat, practical voice, whether there were any other provisions. There were not. That was the whole of it. 3 children, 3 properties, and the youngest daughter got the ruin. Buchanan closed the folder. Colton stood up and stretched like a man who'd just finished a good meal. He clapped a hand on Delaney's shoulder as he passed, and his voice was warm and dripping with false sympathy. Don't feel bad, little sister. Dad probably figured you didn't need much. You were always his favorite anyway. He walked out. Meredith followed him without a word, without so much as looking back. And Delaney sat alone in the chair, her hands still folded in her lap, listening to the ticking of a clock somewhere in the wall and trying to understand what had just happened. The door opened again. She turned, expecting Buchanan. It was Silas Beaumont. Silas was 68 years old, tall and lean the way old ranchers get lean, with skin like tanned leather and eyes the color of a river at dusk. He had been her father's best friend for 40 years. He'd been at the funeral, standing in the back, his hat in his hands, and he'd cried the way old men cry, without sound, without shame. He was the closest thing to family her father had outside of blood. He crossed the office slowly and sat down in the chair Meredith had just vacated. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He just looked at her. Then he leaned in close, close enough that she could smell the pipe tobacco and the aftershave that he'd probably worn since 1974. And his voice came out low and rough and certain. Your father knew exactly what he was doing. Delaney's breath caught. What? Silas glanced at the door, then back at her. His voice dropped even lower. Willow Creek. He knew what he was doing when he left it to you. Don't you forget that. She stared at him. The words made no sense, and at the same time they made a terrible kind of sense, and she felt something turn over in her chest. Silas, what are you talking about? The old man hesitated. His weathered fingers tapped once against his knee. Then he seemed to decide something. 40 years, Delaney. 40 years I watched people come to your daddy and try to buy that piece of land. Ranchers, developers, oil men. Every one of them offered him a fair price, and some of them offered him a great deal more than fair. He turned every single one of them down. He never told me that. He never told anybody. But I knew, because I was there. And 6 months ago, right before he got sick, a company out of Houston sent a man up here in a $3,000 suit, sat right across from your father at the kitchen table, and slid a piece of paper across to him. You know what that piece of paper said? She shook her head. She couldn't speak. $1 million, cash. For Willow Creek. The room seemed to tilt. 3 million, Silas said quietly, for 300 acres of scrub brush and a fallen-down house. And your father looked that man in the eye and said no. Didn't even think about it. Just said no. Why? Silas smiled. And it was a sad smile, and a knowing smile, and something else. He stood up and put his hat on. That's the question, isn't it? Your father always said that land would find its right owner. He was patient about it, real patient. And now here you are. He paused at the door. You come out to see me when you're ready. Bring a notebook. And then he was gone. Delaney sat in the empty office for a long time. Outside, the February wind pushed dry leaves across the parking lot. Somewhere in her mind, a door had opened that she hadn't known was there, and beyond it was a darkness she couldn't yet see into. $3 million. And her father had said no. She thought of the way he had looked at her in the hospital, the way he had tried to speak. She thought of the little girl she had been, riding in the front seat of his pickup truck, out to Willow Creek on Saturday mornings, while Colton and Meredith stayed home because they didn't like the dust. She thought of the way her father used to crouch down beside her by the old cypress trees, take a handful of soil, and let it run through his fingers. You see this, Delaney girl. Most folks look at this land and they see nothing. But if you know how to look, this land will tell you things. She hadn't understood then. She'd been 6 years old, 7, 8. She just liked being with her father. She'd liked the way he smelled of pipe smoke and horses. She'd liked that he took her hand when they walked. And now he was gone, and he had left her the worst piece of land in the county. And a man who had known him for 40 years had just told her that this worst piece of land was worth $3 million to someone. She stood up. Her legs felt unsteady. She gathered her purse and walked out of Buchanan's office, and she did not cry, because Ashford women didn't cry in public. Her father had taught her that too. That evening she took Preston Kilmer out to see the place. Preston was 30 years old, an insurance broker from Austin, with the kind of clean-shaven good looks that photographed well, and the kind of ambition that made him check his phone during dinner. They had been together for 3 years. She had thought more than once that he would probably ask her to marry him this year. She had thought more than once that she would probably say yes. They drove out of Cedar Falls in Preston's silver SUV, past the town limits, past the last of the paved roads, and onto the long gravel track that led up into the hills. Delaney watched the country go by. She hadn't been out here in almost 10 years. It looked exactly the same. The same live oaks, the same limestone outcroppings, the same distant blue silhouette of the hills. She had told Preston about the will. She had watched his face when she told him. He had said all the right things. He had held her hand. He had said they would figure it out. Now, as they came around the last bend and the homestead appeared through the winter trees, she watched his face again. She saw it fall. Willow Creek Homestead in February 2026 was a wound on the landscape. The main house was a 2-story wood frame structure that had once been white, though whatever paint remained now was more gray than white, peeling in long curls from boards that had gone soft with rot. The porch sagged to one side. 2 of the 4 porch posts had rotted through at the base and were held up by nothing but memory and habit. The roof was patched with rusted tin in places and open to the sky in others. The barn behind the house had partially collapsed. The fences were down. The pastures had been swallowed by cedar and prickly pear and mesquite, and a thicket of brush had grown right up to the walls of the house, as if the land itself were trying to reclaim what humans had abandoned. Preston stopped the SUV at the gate. He did not turn the engine off. "This is it. This is it." He stared through the windshield. He did not get out. "Delaney, I know. Delaney, this isn't a piece of property. This is a demolition project. This is a liability. I know how it looks. Do you? Because I'm not sure you do. Do you have any idea what it would cost to make this even habitable? Not profitable, just habitable. $200,000, easy, probably more. I have the cash inheritance." He turned to look at her. His face was the face of a man doing math. "You have $150,000 from your father. That was your future. That was supposed to be a down payment on a real life. And you want to pour it into this." She opened her door. She got out. The wind was cold. It smelled of cedar and old grass and something else, something under the surface, something clean. She walked away from the SUV, away from Preston, toward the old gate that was hanging by one hinge. She pushed through it and walked into the yard. Behind her, she heard Preston get out. She heard his boots on the gravel. He was following her, but he was following her slowly, the way a man follows something he has already decided to leave behind. She kept walking. She walked past the sagging porch and around the side of the house. She stopped. There, at the edge of the yard, stood a live oak so old and so wide that 4 grown men could not have joined hands around its trunk. She remembered it. She remembered it perfectly. Her father had brought her here as a little girl and sat under this tree with her. He had told her the tree was 200 years older than Texas itself. She walked to it. She put her hand on the bark, and that was when she saw the post. It was set into the ground about 6 feet from the base of the tree. A wooden post, about waist high, weathered gray and soft with age. It had been there a long time, longer than she had been alive. She crouched down beside it. Carved into the wood, deep and clean, were 2 letters and a date. H.A. 1985. Her father's initials, Hollis Ashford. The year before she was born, the year, according to Silas Beaumont, that people had first started trying to buy this land. She traced the letters with her thumb. Behind her, she heard Preston's footsteps stop. Delaney. She did not turn around. Delaney, I think we need to talk. She stood up slowly. She turned. Preston was standing in the yard with his hands in his coat pockets, and his face had that careful, arranged look that people wear when they are about to say something they have already practiced in their head. I don't think this is going to work, he said. She said nothing. Not the property. Us. I don't think we're going in the same direction anymore. I have a career. I have a plan. And this, he gestured at the ruin around them, this is going to eat up years of your life. Maybe all of them. And I can't watch that happen. Still, she said nothing. I'll drive you back to town. No. Delaney, I said no. She surprised herself with how steady her voice was. I'll get a ride. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, the way a man nods when he has just gotten permission to do what he wanted to do anyway, and he turned and walked back to the SUV. She heard the door close. She heard the engine start. She heard the tires on the gravel. And then she was alone. She stood by the old post with her father's initials on it, and she listened to the wind move through the branches of the 200-year-old oak, and she did not cry. 3 years of her life had just driven away in a silver SUV, and she did not cry. Instead, she looked at the house, really looked at it. She saw the ruin, yes, but she also saw the way the afternoon light fell across what was left of the porch. She saw the good bones under the rot. She saw where a garden could go. She saw where a new fence line could run. You see this, Delaney girl? Most folks look at this land and they see nothing. She stayed until the sun went low. Then she walked out to the road and started the 2-mile hike back toward the county highway. Silas Beaumont found her a mile in. He was driving an old red Ford pickup, and he pulled up beside her without a word, leaned across, and pushed the passenger door open. She climbed in. Preston? He asked. Gone. Silas nodded once, as if he had expected exactly this, and put the truck in gear. The next morning at first light, Silas came back. This time he brought his son. Wyatt Beaumont was 32 years old, 6'2", built like a man who had done real work every day of his life. Dark hair, gray eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been chiseled and then set to dry in the sun. He wore a canvas work coat and jeans and boots that had seen a lot of ground. He got out of the truck when they pulled up to the homestead, and he looked at the house, and he looked at Delaney, and he said, "Morning, ma'am." And that was all he said. Silas made the introductions. Wyatt was an agricultural engineer, Silas explained, and had come back to Cedar Falls a year ago after a project down in Austin had gone under. He knew soil. He knew water. He knew how to build things that lasted. He's here to help, Silas said, whether he likes it or not. Wyatt's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. But he didn't argue. He walked past Delaney to the porch and started pulling rotten boards off the steps without a word, testing them, tossing the worst ones into a pile. They worked all day. Silas taught Delaney how to use a pry bar. Wyatt taught her, without ever really speaking, that a woman who was willing to sweat was a woman who deserved respect. They cleared the porch. They pulled down what was left of the collapsed section of the barn. They dragged brush away from the walls of the house so that for the first time in years, the building could breathe. At one point, sitting on the tailgate of the truck drinking water, Delaney asked Wyatt what he thought. He looked at the house for a long time. "I think," he said, "you're going to spend everything you have and then some, and at the end of it, you'll have a nice-looking piece of land in the middle of nowhere. If that's what you want, we can get you there." That's not exactly an endorsement. He almost smiled. I don't do endorsements. I do honest work. That afternoon they found the notebook. It was in the back of the old shed behind the house, in a cabinet that had fallen over on its side, mostly buried under dirt and rat droppings and 40 years of neglect. Delaney was clearing the shed with a shovel when the shovel hit something that didn't sound like wood. She knelt down. She dug with her hands. She pulled out an old metal cash box, rusted shut. She pried it open with the pry bar. Inside, wrapped in an oilcloth that had gone stiff with age, was a leather-bound notebook, black weathered, about the size of a paperback book. She opened it. The handwriting was her father's. She would have known it anywhere. She had a birthday card from him on her dresser at home with the same handwriting on it. Most of the pages had been torn out. Whoever had torn them had done it carefully, one at a time, leaving only the stubs along the spine. But some pages remained. On those remaining pages, her father had drawn maps. Simple maps, in pencil, of the Willow Creek property. He had marked points on those maps with letters and numbers. He had made notes in the margins about soil composition, about drainage, about something he had labeled only as the source. And on the last remaining page, at the bottom, in her father's clear, firm hand, was a single sentence. When Delaney is ready, she will understand. She sat down right there on the dirt floor of the shed. Silas came in behind her. He looked over her shoulder. When he read the sentence at the bottom of the page, he made a sound she had never heard from him before. Not quite a word, something between a breath and a prayer. "You've seen this before?" she asked. "No, but you know what it means." Silas took a long time to answer. He took his hat off. He turned it in his hands. He looked at the notebook. "I know your father never wrote anything down without a reason. And I know he never left anything to chance. And I know that if he wrote your name in a book and hid the book in a shed on a piece of land he refused to sell for $3 million, then he was telling you something. He was telling you to look. Look for what?" "That," said Silas, "is what you're going to have to find out." That evening, just before sundown, another vehicle came up the gravel road. It was a black extended cab pickup, new and polished, catching the last of the light. It pulled through the gate and stopped in the yard. Colton Ashford got out. He was wearing a white shirt and a black hat and a smile that Delaney recognized from 1,000 family dinners. It was the smile he wore when he was about to take something that wasn't his. "Little sister." "Colton." He walked up onto the ruined porch as if he owned it. He looked around. He whistled low. "You've been busy." "Some. You know, I've been thinking about you, about this place. And I have to say, I feel bad. I really do. Dad shouldn't have done this to you." "Done what?" "Left you this. It isn't right. So I want to make it right." He reached into his coat pocket. He took out an envelope. He held it out to her. 80,000. Cash offer. I'll take it off your hands, add it to my acreage, and you can walk away with a real start. Buy yourself a house in town. Start over. She looked at the envelope. She did not take it. 80,000. Fair price for what it is. You know what it is? Something flickered in his eyes, just for an instant. Then the smile came back. "I know it's a money pit. I know you don't deserve to be stuck with it. That's what I know," she said, very quietly. "It's not for sale." The smile stayed on his mouth. It left his eyes entirely. "Delaney, think about this." "I have thought about it. You're going to run yourself into the ground. Maybe, but it's not for sale." Colton looked at her for a long moment. Then he put the envelope back in his coat and tipped his hat. "You know where to find me when you change your mind." He walked back down off the porch and toward his truck. But halfway there, he paused. He turned slowly and looked past the house, out toward the back of the property, toward the far tree line where Father Cypress grew thick along a low ridge. He looked for a long moment. Then he took his phone out of his pocket. He raised it. He tapped the screen. Delaney watched him take 3 photographs of the cypress line at the back of the property. He did it as if he thought no one was watching. Then he put the phone away, got in his truck, and drove out. Delaney stood on the porch and watched his taillights disappear down the gravel road. She turned to Silas, who had come up beside her, and she saw that he was watching too, and that his face had gone very still. "Silas, I saw. Why would he take pictures of the back of my property?" "That," said Silas Beaumont, "is a very good question." That night, alone in the small guest cabin behind Silas and Wyatt's place a mile down the road, Delaney sat on the bed and turned the notebook over and over in her hands. The notebook her father had hidden. The notebook with her name written in the last sentence. She ran her fingers along the spine. She looked at the torn edges of the missing pages. And then, because something told her to, she pressed her thumbs against the inside of the back cover. The leather was slightly loose there. She had not noticed it before. She worked at it carefully, and after a moment, the inner lining of the back cover peeled away from the board. Something fell into her lap. A folded piece of paper, small, cream-colored old. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. There were no words on it. There was only a set of numbers: 30, 4,127 degrees noon 98, 7,891 degrees W. GPS coordinates. She stared at them. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She got up. She went to the small desk where Silas had left her a laptop to use, and she opened it and she pulled up a map. She typed in the coordinates. The map zoomed. It centered on a point in the Texas Hill Country, in Kendall County, on a 300-acre parcel of land. The point was at the back of the Willow Creek property, right in the middle of the cypress line, exactly where Colton had stopped his truck, exactly where he had raised his phone, exactly where he had taken 3 photographs of something he thought no one else knew existed. Delaney closed the laptop very slowly. She sat in the dark for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the hills, and somewhere far off, a coyote called, and somewhere much closer, in the small, quiet room of her heart, a door that had been locked for 28 years began very slowly to open. Her father had left her a puzzle. Her brother knew part of the answer. And she was, for the first time since the funeral, no longer thinking about what she had lost. She was thinking about what she was going to find. The next morning, Delaney was up before the sun. She had not slept much. The GPS coordinates had burned themselves into the back of her eyelids every time she closed them. She had lain in the dark, thinking about her brother, thinking about her father, thinking about the way a man in a $3,000 suit had once sat across a kitchen table in Cedar Falls and slid a piece of paper toward Hollis Ashford that said $3 million. And her father had said no. At first light, she dressed in jeans and boots and a canvas jacket, tucked the folded coordinates into her breast pocket, and walked the mile back down the county road to Willow Creek. The February air was sharp and clean. Her breath came out in white plumes. When she reached the homestead, Silas and Wyatt were already there. Silas was making coffee on a camp stove on the tailgate of his truck. Wyatt was sharpening the blade of a machete. She showed them the coordinates. Silas read them twice. He looked at his son. Wyatt looked at the paper for a long moment, then at the tree line where the cypress grew thick along the back ridge, and then he said only, "Let's go." They pushed through the brush for the better part of an hour. Wyatt went first with the machete, cutting a path through mesquite and cedar and thorny thickets of prickly pear that grabbed at their jeans. Silas came behind him, and Delaney followed. Nobody spoke. The ground rose slightly, then dipped, and the character of the land began to change. The scrubby cedar thinned. The soil grew softer under their boots. The air took on a different smell, a mineral smell, cool and old. And then, without warning, the trees opened up. Delaney stopped so suddenly that Silas nearly walked into her back. Before them, cupped in a hollow of the land and hidden on every side by a wall of cypress trees 50 feet tall, was a lake. It was not a pond. It was not a stock tank. It was a lake. Perhaps 10 acres of water, maybe a little more, clear as glass at the shallows where they stood, and going deep and dark toward the middle. The cypress trees leaned over the water on all sides, their roots braided into the banks. The morning light was just beginning to come down through the branches, and it fell on the surface of the lake in long slanted columns, and the water lay so still that Delaney could see the reflection of the sky in it, unbroken, as if the world had been folded in half. Nobody said anything for a full minute. Then Wyatt walked to the edge of the water. He crouched down, he cupped his hand and lifted some of it to his face. He smelled it. He touched his tongue to it. He stood up slowly, and when he turned, his gray eyes had something in them that Delaney had not seen before. "This isn't runoff," he said. "This is spring-fed, and it's not just spring-fed. It's clean, it's colder than it should be, and it's got mineral content that means it's coming up from deep." "How deep?" "Deep." He looked out across the water. "This is aquifer water. And the aquifers under this part of Texas, the ones that go deep enough to feed something like this, those are the big ones." Silas walked up beside him. The old man was very quiet. He took his hat off and held it against his chest, the way a man does in church, or in the presence of a thing he does not fully understand. "Hollis," he said softly. He was not speaking to anyone in the group. He was speaking to a man 20 days in the ground. "Hollis, you old fox, you knew." Delaney stood on the bank and watched the light on the water. And for the first time since her father had died, she felt something in her chest that was not grief. It was closer to awe. It was closer to recognition. Her father had left her a lake. Her father had left her a lake that no one else knew existed. And for 40 years, he had refused every offer that came his way because he had known all along exactly what he was protecting. Over the next 3 weeks, the shape of a plan began to take form. Delaney threw herself into research the way a drowning woman throws herself at a rope. She drove into Austin twice and sat in the library at the University of Texas for 6 hours at a stretch, reading everything she could find about aquaculture in Texas. She spoke to 2 fisheries biologists on the phone. She visited a rainbow trout operation up near Fredericksburg and spent an entire day walking the raceways with the owner, a former Marine named Halvorson, who told her, when she asked, it was possible to run a cold water fish operation in Texas, but only if you had a source of cold spring-fed water at consistent temperature, and only if you knew what you were doing. She said, "I have the water." He said, "Then you have half of what most people never get." Wyatt worked alongside her every day. He designed the filtration system. He drew up plans for a series of concentric earthen ponds fed from the natural lake by gravity flow, with overflow and drainage that would not damage the aquifer or disturb the lake itself. He was, she began to see, very good at what he did. He was patient with her when she asked questions, and honest with her when he thought her ideas were wrong. He never once told her she couldn't do something. He only ever told her what it would cost and what it would take. Something began to grow between them. Delaney felt it more than she saw it. It was in the way he passed her a mug of coffee without asking whether she wanted one. It was in the way when they were bent over a set of plans together at the tailgate of his truck. His shoulder would rest against hers, and neither of them would move away. It was in the long silences that had stopped being awkward and become companionable. She thought about it in the evenings when she was alone. She did not name it, but she knew it was there. By the middle of March, she had committed. She took the $150,000 that her father had left her in cash, the money that Preston Kilmer had once called her future, and she poured it into Willow Creek. She contracted an excavation crew out of Kerrville to dig the ponds. She ordered the filtration equipment. She hired a well driller to sink a monitoring well and confirm the aquifer connection. And on the first day of April, she took delivery of her first shipment of rainbow trout fingerlings, 12,000 of them, packed in oxygenated bags in the back of a refrigerated truck. She stood at the edge of the first pond as the driver released them, and she watched the small silver bodies scatter into the clean, cold water. And as she thought about her father, and she thought about the way he used to crouch beside her under the cypress trees when she was 6 years old, and she found that her eyes had gone hot. That was the good week. The next week, Rutherford Vance arrived. He came in a black Cadillac SUV with Harris County plates. He wore a gray suit and a bolo tie with a piece of turquoise the size of a quarter, and his boots were polished to a high shine. He was perhaps 55 years old, silver-haired, with a face that had been sanded smooth by money. He came alone. He pulled up in front of the homestead at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, got out of the SUV, and stood in the yard looking at the newly cleared land and the excavation work at the back of the property. Delaney walked out to meet him. Miss Ashford, Rutherford Vance. He extended his hand. His grip was firm and dry. I represent an investment group out of Houston. Real property, mineral rights, water rights, that kind of thing. I wonder if you'd give me 10 minutes of your time. She gave him 15. They sat on the porch steps because the porch was still not safe. He was pleasant. He was smart. He asked her about the aquaculture operation, and he asked her the right questions, the kind of questions that told her he already knew more about her plans than a stranger should. He complimented her on her vision, and then, in the manner of a man closing a business meeting, he made her an offer. $500,000 for Willow Creek. Cash. 30-day close. She looked at him. That's a lot more than my brother offered. He smiled. He did not blink. Your brother is not my client, and your brother is not authorized to speak for the group I represent. And your group is interested in Willow Creek because recreational property, retreat land for our investors. Retreat land, yes, ma'am. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, Mr. Vance, I am sitting on a porch that is falling down. I have 12,000 fish that just arrived yesterday. I have a lake at the back of my property that a man doesn't offer $500,000 for unless he knows something. What is it that you know? The smile did not flicker. I have made you a generous offer, Miss Ashford. I would suggest you consider it carefully. I'll do that. He stood. He handed her his card. He walked back to the Cadillac and drove away. That night, Silas came to see her. He sat across from her at the little table in the kitchen of the guest cabin, and he laid a manila folder in front of her. I've been asking around about Vance, and your brother. He opened the folder. Inside were printout of hotel receipts, 3 of them, from a business hotel in Austin. A friend of mine works the front desk at the Driscoll. Colton has been meeting with Rutherford Vance in that hotel bar every 6 weeks for the past year. Sometimes longer. They know each other, Delaney. They know each other well. She looked at the receipts. The dates went back more than a year. Long before her father had died. Silas, I know. They've been planning this. For a while, yes. She put the receipts down. She looked at her hands. They were shaking, but not from fear. From something colder and cleaner than fear. He was going to buy it from Dad, wasn't he? Colton was going to inherit it eventually. Or he was going to convince Dad to sell, and Vance was going to buy it. And when Dad died and left it to me, they had to change the plan. That's what I think. So they figure I'm the weak link. I'm the one who can be pushed. Silas said nothing. That was answer enough. Delaney was quiet for a long time. Then she said, well, they're wrong about that. But being right did not stop what came next. 10 days later, on a Saturday morning, Delaney walked down to the ponds at first light and found the water covered in silver. Thousands of trout, belly up, floating in a dead carpet across the surface of the first 2 ponds and starting to accumulate in the third. She stood on the earthen berm and could not move. The rising sun caught the scales of the dead fish and threw the light back at her in 1,000 small flashes. And for a moment, she thought she might actually fall down. She called Wyatt. He was there in 12 minutes. He walked the ponds. He knelt at the outflow. He examined the filtration equipment. He pulled a fish from the water and looked at its gills. He did not speak for almost an hour. Then he came back to where she was standing. The stock came in sick. There was a pathogen in the fingerlings. That's the primary cause. But he hesitated. But somebody adjusted the drain valve on the number 2 pond during the night. It was cranked all the way down. When the sick fish started dying, the water couldn't circulate. It concentrated the pathogen and killed everything else. If the valve had been at spec, we'd have lost maybe a third. As it is, we've lost almost everything. She stared at him. Somebody was here, on my property, last night. Somebody who knew the system. He looked at her, and his face was as hard as she had ever seen it. Somebody who knew exactly which valve to touch. The lab report from Texas A&M came back 4 days later. The fingerlings had been infected with a bacterial pathogen at the point of origin. She got the invoice from the supplier and looked up the delivery driver's employer. The supplier was a legitimate company, but when she called them and asked how her lot had been contaminated, the manager was evasive. He said there had been a mix-up. He said he was sorry. He said her money would be refunded. Silas found out 3 days after that the same supplier had recently taken on a new silent investor, a shell company registered in Delaware. The shell company's mailing address was the same building in Houston as Rutherford Vance's investment group. By the end of April, the rumor had spread through Cedar Falls that the Ashford girls' fish operation was poisoning the water table, that her lake was contaminated, that she was going to bring down property values in the whole county. 3 restaurant buyers who had signed letters of intent to purchase her production called and canceled. When she went into the feed store on a Thursday afternoon to pick up an order, 2 ranchers she had known her whole life did not meet her eyes. She heard from a woman at the diner that her brother Colton had told half the county over drinks that his little sister was in over her head, and that the water at Willow Creek couldn't be trusted. She stood in the parking lot of the feed store and felt her hands go cold. That night, Wyatt came to the cabin. He did not sit down. He stood just inside the door with his hat in his hand. "Delaney, I've been thinking." She knew before he said the next word what was coming. "I think you'd be better served if you brought in somebody with more experience. Somebody who's actually built something before. I'm not the right person for this." "Wyatt, I ran a project in Austin 2 years ago. It failed. Lost my father a lot of money. Lost some other people a lot more. I told myself I was ready to come back and do good work. But every time something goes wrong up here, I look at you and I think about the fact that you deserve somebody who won't drag you down. That is the stupidest thing you have ever said to me." He looked at her. He did not speak. "You have been the one thing that hasn't gone wrong. You are what has been keeping this together, and now you're going to walk out because you think you're not good enough. I'm not good enough. You're wrong." He held her gaze for a long moment, and then gently he set his hat on the table and turned and walked out. She sat in the cabin alone. She listened to his truck start. She listened to the sound of it fade down the road. And for the first time since Preston Kilmer had driven away in his silver SUV 2 months ago, she put her face in her hands. She did not cry, but she came close. The next morning she went back to Willow Creek. There was no one to help her. Wyatt was gone. Silas was in San Antonio for the week helping a nephew with a horse. She was alone on 300 acres of land that had cost her almost everything and given her almost nothing in return. She began methodically to go through the boxes of her father's papers that she had brought over from the main house in Cedar Falls. She was looking for something. She did not know what. She found it just after 2 in the afternoon. It was in a manila envelope at the bottom of the 3rd box. The envelope was sealed with old tape that had gone brown and brittle. She slit it open with her pocket knife. Inside were geological survey reports, 4 of them, bound with paper clips that had rusted through and stained the pages orange. The reports were dated 1983, 1984, 1986, and 1988. They had been commissioned by Hollis Ashford and prepared by a firm out of San Antonio. The reports concerned the subsurface geology of the Willow Creek property. Delaney read them all. It took her 3 hours. She was not a geologist, and much of the technical language was over her head. But she understood the summaries. She understood the maps. And she understood, with a growing sense of vertigo, what her father had been sitting on for 40 years. The Willow Creek property lay directly over the Edwards Aquifer. Not the edges of it, not the shallow parts of it, the deep artesian zone. The part of the aquifer that produced some of the cleanest, most valuable fresh water in the state of Texas. The lake at the back of the property was not just spring-fed. It was one of the primary surface expressions of the aquifer for 30 miles in any direction. A single acre of the Willow Creek surface controlled water rights to a volume of fresh water that, in the current market, was worth 10 times what the land itself would sell for as ranch property. And that was not the worst of it. Clipped to the back of the 1988 report was a handwritten note. In her father's hand, "They are asking about drilling rights again. I told them no. I will always tell them no. Water like this is not for pumping into the ground and blowing rocks apart. If I have to hold this land until I am in the grave, I will hold it, and I will pass it to the child who understands why." She sat on the floor of the shed with the report on her knees, and she read the note 3 times, and then she understood. Rutherford Vance was not interested in recreational property. Rutherford Vance was not interested in a retreat for wealthy investors. Rutherford Vance represented a group that wanted to acquire the water rights under Willow Creek so that they could sell those rights to hydraulic fracturing operations. Fracking. There were oil and gas fields to the west and to the south of Cedar Falls, and every single one of them was starving for clean, fresh water to inject into the wells. A rights holder over the Edwards Aquifer, sitting on a surface expression of that quality, could sell into that market for tens of millions of dollars. And her brother Colton had known. He had known for a year, probably longer. He had been meeting with Vance in a hotel bar in Austin, planning the acquisition. Planning, probably, how to convince their father to sell. And when Hollis had died and left Willow Creek to Delaney instead of to him, he had not walked away. He had gone to Plan B. He had tried to buy it from her. When she said no, he had tried to sabotage her. When the sabotage didn't move her fast enough, he had started the rumors. He was going to destroy her, and he was going to do it because he wanted to sell her water to the men who broke the earth open with it. She sat very still on the floor of the shed. She thought about her father. She thought about the note. She thought about the girl she had been at 6 years old, walking beside him with her small hand in his. Then she stood up, and she walked out of the shed, and she got in her truck, and she drove. But she did not drive to Colton's ranch. Not yet. She was not ready for him yet. She drove to Greenfield farm. She had not been to her sister's place in 8 months. She had not spoken to Meredith since the reading of the will. But something in her, something at the very bottom of her, told her that she needed to see her sister's face when she asked the next question. Meredith answered the door in an apron. There was flour on her hands. She looked at Delaney standing on her porch, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Meredith stepped back from the door. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table. Meredith poured coffee for both of them. She sat down across from Delaney and folded her hands in front of her, and she waited. Delaney said, "Colton is trying to destroy me." Meredith did not react. She only said quietly, "I know." Delaney felt something move under her ribs. "You know. He asked me to help him 6 weeks ago. He came here and sat where you are sitting now, and he told me about the water. He told me about a man named Vance. He told me that if I helped him push you out, there would be 7 figures in it for me. Cash. Wired to any account I named. 6 weeks. He didn't come to you a year ago, when this all started. No, he didn't need me a year ago. A year ago, he thought you would fold as soon as you saw that house. When Preston left you, when the fish came in, Colton figured you'd sell to him inside of a month. It was only after you refused his offer and put your money in the ponds that he started to worry. He came to me the week the restaurants started canceling. He needed another Ashford on his side to make the story stick in town. He needed me to say publicly that our sister was in over her head. And you said." Meredith looked at her steadily. "I said no." Delaney's throat closed. "Meredith, I have not been a good sister to you, Delaney. I know that. I have been cold, and I have been distant, and I have let our brother push you around your whole life, because it was easier than fighting with him. But I am not going to help him take the one thing our father wanted you to have. She reached across the table. From her apron pocket, she took a folded piece of paper. She slid it across. It was a bank transfer receipt. $50,000 wired 6 weeks ago to an account in Delaney's name at the Cedar Falls Savings Bank. Delaney stared at it. I saw the fish operation take a hit, Meredith said. I knew the restaurants were canceling. I knew what he was doing. I did not know how to say it to you, so I did what I could do. Delaney looked up. Her sister's eyes were wet. Meredith, father used to tell me, when I was a little girl, that Delaney sees things nobody else can see. I was jealous of that for a long time. I am not jealous of it anymore. I am proud of it. And I am ashamed of how long it took me to say so. Delaney reached across the table and took her sister's hand. It was the first time in more years than she could count that she had touched Meredith's hand. Outside, the afternoon light was going gold over the fields of Greenfield farm, and somewhere in the distance a red-tailed hawk cried, and Delaney Ashford understood, for the first time in her life, that she was not alone. She was going to fight her brother, and she was going to win. Delaney Ashford drove back to Willow Creek that evening with $50,000 in her account, and a sister she had not known she still had. The sun was going down behind the hills, and the sky over Cedar Falls was the color of old copper, and she gripped the steering wheel with both hands and thought about what she was going to do next. She was not going to run. She was not going to sell. She was not going to let her brother win. She was going to fight in the open. The next morning, she called the editor of the Cedar Falls Herald. Her name was Ruth Ainsley, and she had known Hollis Ashford for 30 years. Delaney told her, over the phone, that she wanted to give an exclusive interview about the sabotage of her aquaculture operation, and that she had the lab reports from Texas A&M to prove the water at Willow Creek was clean. She told her that she had documentation of a coordinated effort by a Houston-based investment group to acquire her property. She told her she was not going anywhere. Ruth Ainsley was at Willow Creek by noon with a photographer and a notebook. The story ran on the front page of the Herald that Sunday. It ran with a photograph of Delaney standing on the bank of the hidden lake, the cypress trees rising behind her, her hair caught in the wind. It ran with the headline, "An Ashford daughter fights for her father's land." It ran with quotes from the head of the fisheries lab at Texas A&M, who confirmed that the Willow Creek water was among the cleanest surface samples his lab had processed in the past decade. By Monday morning, the phone was ringing off the hook. 2 of the 3 restaurants that had canceled their contracts called back and asked to reinstate. A third called and asked to double their original order. A wholesale distributor out of San Antonio drove up on Tuesday morning to walk the ponds himself. He signed a letter of intent for 50% of her second-year production before he left the property. The rumors did not die all at once. Rumors never do. But they began to lose their teeth. On Wednesday, she drove out to see Wyatt. The Beaumont place was a mile down the county road, tucked into a fold of the hills. She parked in front of the barn and got out. Wyatt was up on a ladder, patching a section of tin roof. He saw her coming. He did not come down. She stood at the base of the ladder and looked up at him. "Come down here. I'm working. Wyatt Beaumont, get down off that ladder." He came down. He did not look at her when his feet touched the ground. He busied himself with putting his hammer back in his tool belt. She waited until he was still. Then she said, "You told me I deserved someone who wouldn't drag me down. Do you remember that?" He nodded once. "Well, I have been thinking about that a lot, and I have come out here to tell you something." She took a breath. "The man I want beside me is not the man who shows up when everything is going right. Any fool can stand next to a woman when she's winning. The man I want is the one who stays when everything is falling apart. The one who was there when I found the lake. The one who was there when the fish died. The one who fixed the drain valve at midnight in the rain. That is the man I want. That is the man I have been standing next to for 5 months. And you don't get to walk away from that because you made a bad call on a project in Austin 2 years ago. He looked at her then, really looked at her. His gray eyes had something in them that she had not seen before. Delaney, I am not finished. If you tell me that you don't want to be here, I will accept that. But if you tell me you don't deserve to be here, I am going to be very angry with you, because that is not your decision to make. That is my decision, and I have made it. For a long moment he did not speak. Then he said, very quietly, I don't want to be anywhere else. Good. Delaney, yes, I'm sorry. I know you are. Come back to work. He came back to work. They rebuilt. Through the rest of April and all of May, they rebuilt. Wyatt sourced a new lot of trout fingerlings from a certified operation in Colorado, ran their health certifications himself, and personally supervised the delivery. Delaney redesigned the security around the ponds and installed motion-activated cameras on every valve and pump housing. She hired 2 men from town as full-time hands. She met with the wholesale distributor twice more and expanded the letter of intent into a firm 3-year contract. She began to draft, with Wyatt at her side in the evenings, the business plan for a second venture, one that had been forming in the back of her mind since the day she had first read the geological reports. She was going to bottle the water, not sell the rights, not lease them to fracking companies, not let a single drop of the Edwards aquifer be pumped underground to break open shale for oil and gas. She was going to bottle it herself, at the source, and sell it directly, 1 bottle at a time, to consumers who cared where their water came from. She was going to call it Willow Creek Springs. She was going to protect what her father had protected. She was going to keep it above ground, in the light, for as long as there was a Willow Creek to protect it with. By the middle of June, she had a business plan. By the end of July, she had a partner in a small Austin-based bottling company willing to co-invest in the equipment. By the middle of August, the first pallets of Willow Creek Springs, in matte glass bottles with a simple label showing a cypress tree over water, went out to 12 high-end grocery stores in Austin, Dallas, and Houston. They sold out in 9 days. That was when the invitation arrived. It came in a heavy cream envelope, hand-delivered to the Homestead by a young man in a black polo shirt. Colton Ashford was hosting a gala at Blackwood Ranch on the 2nd Saturday of September to announce a major agricultural investment partnership. All members of the Ashford family were invited. Delaney was welcome to bring a guest. She held the invitation in her hand and stared at it. Wyatt looked over her shoulder. He wants you there. He wants to humiliate me there, in front of his new business partners. He wants me to see him win. Are you going? She smiled. It was not a warm smile. Oh yes, I'm going. She wore a dark green dress that had belonged to her mother. She wore her hair up. She wore small pearl earrings that her father had given her on her 16th birthday. Wyatt wore a charcoal suit tailored that Silas had insisted on paying for. When she came down the steps of the guest cabin that evening and Wyatt saw her, he stopped moving entirely and did not speak for perhaps 10 seconds. She said, "That'll do." He said, "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen." Silas drove them to Blackwood Ranch in his old red truck. He would not come inside. He said he was not dressed for it and had no interest in it besides. But he wanted, he said, to see them go in. The gala was held on the great lawn behind the main house at Blackwood, under a huge white tent strung with lights. There were perhaps 200 guests. There was a 5-piece band playing on a small stage. There were waiters circulating with silver trays. There were 3 tables at the front with placards for the honored partners of the announcement. And in the center of it all, moving from group to group with a glass of champagne in his hand, was Colton Ashford. Delaney and Wyatt walked in through the main entrance of the tent. The change in the room was immediate. Conversations paused, heads turned. There was a low murmur that traveled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Delaney did not look at anyone directly. She held Wyatt's arm and walked in as if she owned the place, because in a very real sense, she did. She heard from somewhere to her left a woman say, "That is the Willow Creek Springs woman. That is her." She heard from somewhere to her right a man say, "Isn't that Wyatt Beaumont with the Ashford girl?" She heard from directly behind her a hushed and slightly stunned voice say, "Beaumont," as in Beaumont Agricultural. She turned her head, just slightly, and looked at Wyatt. He was looking straight ahead, his jaw set, but there was a faint color rising in his neck above his collar. "Wyatt, later. Wyatt Beaumont. Delaney, later. I promise." She let it go for the moment. But the seed was planted. Colton saw them from across the tent. His face went through a rapid sequence of expressions, none of which she thought he was aware of. Confusion, recognition, fury. Then, with visible effort, a broad social smile that did not touch his eyes. He excused himself from his conversation and made his way toward them. He kissed Delaney on the cheek. His lips were cold. "Little sister, I didn't expect you. I couldn't miss it, Colton. Your big night. And you brought a friend. You know Wyatt Beaumont, I think. I know Silas's son. Yes." He extended his hand. Wyatt shook it, briefly. Neither man smiled. Colton opened his mouth to say something else. But at that moment, from the front of the tent, a voice over the sound system asked the guests to please take their seats, as the main announcement was about to begin. Colton excused himself. He walked to the head table. Delaney and Wyatt were shown to a table 3 rows back. The lights dimmed. A spotlight came up on a small podium. Colton took the microphone. He welcomed the guests. He talked about the Ashford family legacy. He talked about Blackwood Ranch and what it meant to the region. And then he said that he was proud to announce a new partnership, a landmark investment agreement between Ashford Holdings and one of the most respected agricultural investment groups in the state of Texas. He said the name. He said, "Beaumont Agricultural Holdings." Delaney turned her head very slowly and looked at Wyatt. Wyatt was staring at the head table with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not surprise, something closer to weariness. Like a man watching a wave he had been trying to outrun for a long time, finally come down on top of him. Colton was still speaking. He was introducing the representatives of Beaumont Agricultural. 2 men in dark suits stood up at the head table. Colton gestured to them expansively. He said their names. He said they were here to formalize the partnership tonight. He looked out over the crowd and asked whether any other representatives of Beaumont Agricultural were present in the audience, as a courtesy. There was a silence. Then 3 rows back, Wyatt Beaumont stood up. He did not speak, he just stood. The 2 men at the head table looked at him. One of them, the older of the 2, went pale. Whatever confident smile Colton had been wearing froze on his face and then began slowly to fall apart. The older man leaned to the microphone. His voice came out carefully. "Wyatt, we didn't know you were here." "I know you didn't, Uncle Ray." A ripple went through the tent. A woman at a nearby table whispered "Uncle," and the whisper traveled outward. Wyatt's Uncle Ray looked at Colton. Then he looked back at Wyatt. Then he looked very briefly at Delaney. He said into the microphone, "I don't believe we can proceed with this announcement tonight." The tent erupted. Colton was, for one long moment, completely frozen at the front of the room, the microphone still in his hand, his mouth still half open on a sentence he was no longer going to be able to finish. 2 of his other investment guests stood up and began, without a word, to gather their things. Delaney reached up and took Wyatt's hand. He looked down at her. He was still standing, she whispered. "Sit down, sweetheart, it's all right." He sat. Outside the tent, 20 minutes later, when the gala had collapsed into confused knots of departing guests, and Colton had disappeared into the main house of Blackwood Ranch, Wyatt walked Delaney out to where Silas was waiting in the truck. He told her, quietly, as they walked. His mother's family owned Beaumont Agricultural Holdings. It had been founded by his grandfather, an oilman turned rancher, and had grown into one of the largest privately held agricultural investment groups in West Texas. Wyatt was the sole grandson on that side of the family, and when his grandfather died, the trust would come to him. He had known this his entire life. He had never spoken of it to anyone in Cedar Falls because he had wanted, more than anything, to be judged for the work he did with his hands and not for the money his family had. He had failed at his Austin project on his own terms, with his own capital, because he had refused to use the family money. He had come home to Cedar Falls to start over as a man with a name and nothing else. And he had met Delaney Ashford, and he had fallen in love with her without telling her any of this, because he had wanted her to fall in love with him, if she was going to, for who he was and not for what he was worth. Delaney listened to all of it in silence. When he was finished, they were standing beside Silas's truck. Silas was watching them through the windshield and being tactful enough to pretend that he was not. Delaney said, "Wyatt, yes, I fell in love with you the day you fixed the drain valve at midnight in the rain. Delaney, that is the man I love. That has been the man I love for a long time. The rest of it, the family, the trust, all of it. It doesn't matter to me. Do you understand? Yes. Then you never have to apologize for it again." He kissed her in the driveway of Blackwood Ranch under the September stars. The federal investigators arrived in Cedar Falls 3 weeks later. Rutherford Vance's Houston-based investment group had been under federal scrutiny for over a year, it turned out, for a pattern of land acquisitions that involved coordinated market manipulation, tortious interference with contracts, and, in 2 documented cases, outright fraud. The Willow Creek attempted acquisition was not the first time Vance's group had tried to push a rural landowner off valuable water rights. It was the third. The FBI already had a case built. Delaney's cooperation, her documentation of the sabotage, her records of Vance's offer, and the hotel receipts that Silas had gathered from the Driscoll in Austin added the final layer of evidence they had been waiting for. Vance was arrested at his home in Houston on the 1st of October. Colton Ashford was not arrested. He had not, technically, broken federal law, but his role in the sabotage came out in the discovery process, and by the middle of November, 3 of his largest investment partners had quietly withdrawn from Blackwood-related ventures. He lost, in the space of 6 weeks, most of the outside capital he had built his personal wealth around. He did not lose Blackwood Ranch itself. That was still his. But he was, for the first time in his adult life, a man reduced to what his father had actually left him, and nothing more. Meredith stopped speaking to him entirely. The renovation of the main house at Willow Creek began in earnest in October. Wyatt hired a contractor out of Fredericksburg, who specialized in restoring historic Texas farmhouses, and the 2 of them spent long hours with the plans on the kitchen table of the little guest cabin. Delaney worked beside them. The idea was to bring the old house back to what it had been in her grandfather's time, and then to make it more than that. A working home, a base of operations for the aquaculture business and the water bottling company both. A place for a family. They opened the walls in the front parlor on a cold morning in November. The contractor called Delaney over. He had found something. Behind the plaster of the west wall of the parlor, tucked into a narrow cavity that had been carefully framed out by a carpenter a long time ago, was a small wooden box. It was about the size of a shoebox. It was oak, dark with age, with a simple brass latch and no lock. Delaney took it down from the wall with her own hands. She carried it to the kitchen. Wyatt was with her. Silas, who had been out at the ponds when the contractor called, drove up as they were setting the box on the table. She opened it. Inside were papers. An envelope on top, cream-colored, sealed, with her name written on the front in her father's handwriting. Beneath the envelope, a set of architectural sketches, hand-drawn, detailed. A rendering of the Willow Creek main house as it might one day be, restored and expanded, with a wide front porch running the length of the building, a garden along the south side, a gravel drive lined with young live oaks, And, most striking of all, a small pavilion by the lake at the back of the property, screened by cypress trees, with a wooden dock running out over the water. Delaney looked at the sketches for a long time. She looked at the way the porch had been drawn. She looked at the way the garden was laid out. She looked at the pavilion by the water. She had drawn, in her own notebook, over the past 3 months, plans that were almost identical to these. Her father had imagined this exact place, 30 years ago, before she was born. She picked up the envelope. Her hands were shaking. She broke the seal. She read the letter aloud, because she could not have read it silently. My dear Delaney, if you are reading this letter, then you have found what I meant for you to find, and you have become the woman I always believed you would become. I have to explain something to you now, something that I never found the right way to tell you while I was alive. I hope you will forgive me for that. I did not leave you Willow Creek because it was the worst piece of land I owned. I left it to you because it was the best. It is the best because of what lies under it, and it is the best because of what it will take to protect it. Any child of mine could have run Blackwood. Any child of mine could have run Greenfield. But only one of my children could have seen Willow Creek for what it truly is. Colton has power in him. He does not have vision. Meredith has wisdom in her. She does not have courage. Only you, my youngest, have both. You saw what other people did not see when you were 6 years old. You saw it when you were 16, and I trusted, when I made my will, that you would see it again. You should know that I refused $3 million for this land. I refused it because the men who wanted to buy it wanted to pump the water out of the ground and use it to break rock apart for oil. I could not let that happen. I could not let this water, that has been under our family's care for 4 generations, be turned into a tool for that. But I was an old man, and I was tired, and I could not fight forever. So I did the only thing I could do. I passed the fight to the one person I trusted to keep fighting. Take care of the water, Delaney. Take care of the land. Take care of the family, even the ones who do not deserve it, because they are still your family, and you are stronger than they are. I am so proud of you. I was proud of you before you were born. Your father, Hollis, she could not speak when she finished. She set the letter down on the table. Wyatt put his hand on hers. Silas Beaumont, 68 years old, who had known Hollis Ashford for 40 years, stood with his hat in his hands and his eyes closed, and did not try to hide the fact that he was crying. They were married the following June, on the bank of the hidden lake, under the cypress trees. It was a small wedding, 90 guests. The whole town of Cedar Falls, it seemed, wanted to come. But Delaney and Wyatt had agreed early on that they wanted only the people they loved. Meredith walked Delaney down the aisle. Silas, standing in as the closest thing Wyatt had to a second father in that place, stood as best man. The pavilion by the lake had been built, exactly as her father had drawn it, and the dock ran out over the still clean water, and the June light came down through the cypress branches in long slanted columns, exactly as it had on the morning Delaney had first seen the lake 16 months before. Colton came. He was not on the guest list, but Meredith had told him privately that he could come if he came alone, and if he came without expectations. And he had accepted both conditions. He stood at the back during the ceremony. He did not speak to anyone. When it was over, and the small crowd had moved toward the pavilion for the reception, he walked up to Delaney where she stood with Wyatt by the edge of the water. He held out an envelope. "He left this for me," Colton said. His voice was rough. "The lawyer gave it to me the same day he gave you yours. I have never opened it until this week." Delaney took the envelope. Colton said, "I read it, and I am not the man he hoped I would be, but I would like to try to be, if you will let me." She looked at her brother. She looked at his face, which was thinner than it had been a year ago, and older, and, for the first time in her memory, uncertain. She thought of her father, and she thought of what her father had asked her to do. She said, "Come to the reception, Colton." He did. Later that evening, when the guests had thinned and the light was going gold over the water, Delaney read the letter that had been in Colton's envelope. It was short. It said only, "My son, I have left you the biggest ranch because you needed it more than your sisters did. I hope one day you will understand that biggest is not the same as best, and that the man who learns that difference is the man who has become worth something. Your father." She folded the letter, and she went and found Colton, who was standing alone by the pavilion looking out at the lake, and she put her hand on his arm, and she stood beside him without speaking for a long time. The wind moved through the cypress trees. The water lay still and clean and old under the evening light. And somewhere in the pocket of her wedding dress, folded small, was a copy of the letter her father had written her, tucked against her side like a promise she would carry all her life. Delaney Ashford had not received the worst inheritance. She had received the one her father had been building all his life to give her, and she had honored it.